Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first.
I believe that art does not arise out of a void, and that it is effective when it makes heartfelt human connections, and even more so when it enables a sense of agency, the belief that there is something we can do in the world so that change might be effected. There is power in its ability to engage memory and intellect, compress and distill emotion, idea, and experience. And it is this power which poets and writers seek to harness when speaking to others through their art. Luisa A. Gloria. Welcome to Delmarva Today, Writer's Edition. I'm your host, Harold Wilson. We're very pleased to welcome poet Luisa A. Gloria to our studio to discuss her poetry and her latest book, The Saints of Streets. Luisa is the author of 13 books, including Juan Luna's Revolver, honored with the Ernst Sundin Prize, Trill and Mordant, and most recently, The Saints of Streets. She has won more than 50 literary awards, honors, grants, fellowships, and prizes, including the Manila Critics Circle National Book Award, the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Award for Literature, which is the Pulitzer Prize of the Philippines. In fact, Luisa is an 11-time recipient of the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Award for Literature in 3 genres: poetry, nonfiction, and short fiction, and its Hall of Fame distinction. The Palanca Award is the Philippines' highest literary prize. Her list of awards goes on, and we could use all of our time today simply reciting the honors Luisa has won. To see the full list and read her poetry, please visit Luisa's website at www.luisagloria.com. Luisa received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago and currently teaches at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, where she also directs the MFA Creative Writing Program. Welcome to the Writer's Edition of Delmarva Today, Luisa.
Thank you so much, Hal. I'm pleased to be here. It's an honor.
Luisa, I understand from reading your poetry and reading about you that you were actually raised by 2 mothers. How is it that you have 2 mothers? Who are these women, and what was their impact on your poetry?
Well, my 2 mothers were my adoptive mother and my birth mother. And I suppose it's a commonplace enough type of experience, except that when I was growing up and where I was raised, it was not exactly a culturally acceptable thing to talk about in public. There was a sort of taboo about that. My birth mother is my adoptive mother's younger sister by about 5 or 6 years. She passed away in 2005. She was a very skilled seamstress along with my adoptive mother. Both women were excellent cooks in the kitchen. I grew up in the kitchen along with them, and I was just thinking about these poems too fairly recently, and realized that some of my first writing lessons, my first writing instruction came out of the kitchen. And I tell this story to my students as well. When I was about 2, they put a bag of lima beans in front of me, and they asked me to peel them. And I guess it was to keep me out of their skirts, out of trouble while they worked. But I realized that as an adult, I realized that you don't have to peel the lima beans in order to cook or eat them. So this, I think now in retrospect, was excellent instruction in preparing me for the writing life, to focus devoted attention to even apparently inconsequential small details. So I learned a lot from them.
It's interesting. They both, you're both mothers, in a sense, raised you then.
Mm-hmm.
You lived in the same house.
Yes, we lived in an extended family setting.
Anyone else in your house with you? Your father?
Yes, my father. My birth mother had married and had other children. I have a stepsister, not a stepsister, a half-sister, rather, and 2 half-brothers. And we all kind of grew up in the same extended household setting.
And this is in the Philippines?
This is in the Philippines.
Yeah, where
correct.
in the Philippines?
In Baguio. Yeah. Originally I'm from Baguio City in the Philippines, which, as some of you perhaps who are listening in or watching may know, was designed originally as a colonial hill station by the Chicago architect Daniel Burnham for the American colonial government in the Philippines at the turn of the last century. So it's a place where I grew up, but it's also a place of intersections for me. My coming to America later on in my life, I felt was, in a way, already largely shaped by my encounter with America, or the idea of America as it had been embodied in the city of my childhood and youth.
You wrote, you've written a number of poems that include your mother's.
Yes.
And I wonder if one in particular about their work as seamstress, and wondered if you would read that.
Sure. Maybe I'll read one or a couple of them that have that.
Sure.
Yes, they sewed all my clothes when I was growing up. I don't think I wore off the rack or ready-to-wear clothing until I was in college. And it never occurred to me that there was any other way to do this. And I marvel at that, and I, in a way, mourn the disappearance of the things that are made by hand from our contemporary life. And I think to honor that in part, as well as to honor, of course, the memory of my birth mother who has passed away and my adoptive mother who is still living, I wrote this poem, and it appears in The Saints of Streets. And I will read that first, and then I'll read another poem perhaps on a similar experience.
Okay, thank you.
So this is called Meditation on a Seam. Nights were salted with a puck and punch, punch, punch of sewing needles on cloth, the crease and rustle of patterned paper, outlining arms and bodices of other women who'd wear the clothes these sisters made, my mothers both. She who birthed and she who raised me. Once I woke to a startling sight. They'd hung a wedding dress from the top of the doorway's frame and knelt on the floor with pins in their mouths, working round the hem. Behind them, a window lightened and collared with wings and crowing. Bread rose like the sun and hardened by noon. I carved a path through skins of lima beans and grains of rice into the world. They've taught me how all things in time will turn and pleat, and how one length of cloth might gather all things in, or flutter free. In the dark, because of them, I find lost prayers in the tiny edging around buttonholes in store-bought shirts. Because of them, I never sweep the gathered dust and tears of days outdoors into the rain.
Just beautiful.
Thank you. There's another poem from that part of my life that looks back on similar experiences and also includes a few more. And I think all of them are significant to me because I realize that they have been so fundamental in shaping my own sense of being tethered to a particular place and time. And also this same idea that I mentioned earlier of shaping my aesthetic sense of my, I guess, my poetic rudder and compass, if you could call it that. So I'm reading a poem now called Temple Rubbing, which is from Trill and Mordaunt, the book that came out before Juan Luna's Revolver. And my father is in this book too, and my mother, my adoptive mother, had wanted to start a sewing business and make, clothes in much larger scale than she would.
Yeah. But she needed money.
She needed money, so she wanted to take out a loan. But at the very last minute, my father, who was supposed to be the co-signer for the loan, got very nervous and said, maybe we should rethink this whole idea, this whole enterprise. So this is called Temple Rubbing. And I guess it's also about taking those kinds of risks and what we are willing to do in pursuit of them. Temple Rubbing. Penny wise, pound foolish, my father liked to say. I don't know how he came by this expression and its mixed currencies. It was the 60s. Buddhist monks set themselves aflame with petrol, while Twiggy posed on the pages of Time and Newsweek in miniskirts easier to copy than the way other people lived. We were 6 hours away from the capital. America and England, farther away, like snow in storybooks, where people dressed their skins in fur and skated on foolish ice buffed to the consistency of glass. A heart could twirl so effortlessly on its surface, hold hands with another, as though the thinnest spot could know no breaking. I knew he meant be careful, don't take unnecessary risks. The reason my mother planned months and months how she might wheedle for a row of sewing machines against the wall, bolts of cloth her genre, knotted frog closures and silk rosettes her signatures. Admiring bias cut or drape, her clients thought Hong Kong or Manila. She glowed with pride. She trained my eye to color and design, my tongue to lexicon of ruffle and flounce, chiffon, raw linen, the way a simple seam described the willful piecing of parts so they could be what they were, and also beautiful. When the loan officer arrived with papers saying, "Here, sign and countersign," my father changed his mind, withdrew collateral. Since then, she's returned to that moment of risk, regretting how it wasn't all hers to take. Years later, I see I've taken after her, after all, papering my walls with books, though friends remind me there are public libraries, hunting the poem's elusive thread while everyone else sleeps. I dream of what it's like to skydive even once, of the view from a two-seater plane. When it rains, I hunt the grocery aisles for sunflowers. Do you understand? Extravagance and desire, not necessarily the same. One look, one touch can make all the difference. The bow traveling an extra measure across the throat of the violin to sing the notes that the wood housed before the instrument was made. I think of an Indian temple rubbing, the wealth of coppery detail the crayon transfers from stone and the paper's heavy grain into your hand. Distance collapsed in the image of the woman opening herself and bending at the hip to receive the radiance of the god, his many arms, his dancing. The mouth that moves upon another mouth in silence, as if a torch were being passed through darkness, as if it were the only thing that mattered.
Memory.
Memory.
Louisa. Memory. Tell us memory means to you and how you use memory in your poetry?
Well, to begin with, anything that we do with language by nature harnesses memory. And the way I think about it is that language is already one step at least removed from the actual experience, the actual thing. So in the same way, a poem attempts to embody experience, to enact experience with hopefully the same immediacy as actual experience itself. But there's always something elusive in that divide between languaging the fact and the actual fact itself. So in many ways, language and the poem also is already an elegy for experience. And you can't talk about elegy, you can't talk about memorializing something without having to invoke the way memory works in order to bring it back to you.
Well, how does memory work in your poetry? I mean, you obviously have taken a memory here and you have shaped it in these two poems. What does and all of us understand memory because we all operate off of memory. Everything is past until we bring it into the present. How do you shape? How do you come to shape these memories in your poems?
Well, for me, the poem always has to find a place from which to begin. And whether that's an image, a sound, a fragment of an idea, that is a starting point. But in order to tap into the significance of where that might branch out into as a poem, I have to work really hard at trying to find out what it means. And in order to do that, I also have to look not only at my fund of memories, but also often, not just sometimes, at that larger fund of memories that we can all have access to, like, say, in the public sphere. And I can think of how when we are, for instance, made aware of something that has a large public impact, an event of wide-scale importance or something that really just makes its effect known in a lot of people, we like to remember those moments in terms of what we were also doing at that same time. And so that's where the intersection of the private or the personal with the things outside in the world has a chance to happen. These things have a chance to meet. And in a lot of writing classes, I also talk about this with my students, and I tell them that the poem is something that is a very personal thing, but it becomes much more relevant when other people are able to make a connection to that. Other readers are able to make a connection to that. So perhaps through the imagination, in that way, the poem can rise to that other imperative to make meaning, not only for self, but others, hopefully.
Well, before you read your next poem, let me ask you another quick question about memory. As a writer, do you mine for memories, or do the memories you're going to put in your poems insert themselves into your consciousness, and you say, yes, I've got to write about this?
Right. Very often it's the latter. I'm not really the type of person who works effectively on poems with an outline, and I find that that's very actually contrary to the impetus of the poem and what it wants to become, because it's something that I like to think is also an experience of discovery for me as a writer. So I work with what floats to the surface, if you will, and then I try to figure out what connections I might make from there. So it requires that same attention from my early lessons in peeling lima beans one by one. What does this one have to do with this other one? Right.
Well, just to continue that line for a moment, for our fiction writers out there, I often argue with them, and they say, have your character do this, or your character. And I'm saying often, no. You have to ask your character what they want.
Right.
You have to look at your character. You have created a personality here. You have created an environment for this personality to operate in.
That's exactly the same way for poets and
that's
poetry.
that's what I'm hearing you say to me.
Yes. Very often we want to get our hands on the poem and make it do things that it may not want to do. So it's really a very important skill to learn as a writer, to try and figure out what the organic direction that a poem should take might be because of the elements that have begun to assemble. What does a poem want to become?
Right.
We have to try and listen to that.
What does a story want to become?
That level of information is something that the poem or the story will be telling at different stages of development to the writer.
Well, read your next poem.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that I was going to read a poem from the new book, which is going to come out this summer. I don't think I've mentioned that, or you've mentioned that. The new, I have just received good news in the last 2 weeks from Utah State University Press that Mark Doty has selected a manuscript of mine for the 2014 May Swenson Prize. So this book is coming out in summer, and I wanted to read a poem from this new book to demonstrate. Thank you. It was
so this is
very exciting. Never been read before.
Circulated.
No. And this is what I was trying to say earlier in terms of how the individual memory, the moment from which one writes, kind of intersects with our awareness of what else is out there in the world and how they come into the poem. And so the individual memories can get augmented by that sense of also being connected to a bigger world of events and things that are very ordinary but somehow acquire layers of significance because we bring them together in that moment. This is a prose poem in prose stanzas, and the title is also the first line.
But tell us very quickly what a prose poem is.
A prose poem is a poem that's written in prose stanzas rather than in rhymed or free verse stanzas or couplets or whatnot.
Different from lyric poetry, for instance?
There is a lyric impetus in it too, but I think it harnesses some of the recognizable features of prose in that you might see longer lines that look like prose, and yet they are driven and shaped by the same fund of poetic elements. You use metaphor, you use image, but your objective is not simply narrative. It's not simply, to create a prose enumeration of things, but it's to tap into the way a poem says, the way it says things, because of mainly its metaphorical and lyric bent.
Okay.
So this is my poem. My love, I want to tell you of today, so ordinary, but so full of portents and disclosures. Please, do not roll your eyes or sigh. Do not accuse me of having grown soft, as evidenced by this surfeit of emotion, as if hardness were the only worthy standard of anything these days. I tell you this without unnecessary embellishment, without premeditation. For once, sit still and let me tell you without having to think too much about the words. Do you remember the poet who said that morning, "Why not pluck the ripe fig? Why not take the orange? Why not swivel the fleshy globe of the persimmon loose, just because it was the brightest or most immediate thing you saw, the branch bending low over the neighbor's fence and into your hands? Why not give in to rapture, without comment or accusation, without apology, resisting the urge to camouflage? And it is the same for every instance, in which a body immolates itself, goes up in a protest of flame and smoke before falling off the roof. As in house number 11, Huangshi Village, China, in April, as a line of excavators stands at the ready to tear the walls of wood and plaster down, making way for new grids of steel. The day dims, then spills over into rain. A current in the earth crumbles the belfry of an ancient church, and the hills bury children sleeping in their beds. So it is easy enough to heft moments marked with nothing more than our ticking silences against such sorrows, and deem them unworthy. But something moves again across the field, or passes the threshold, the smallest movement or disturbance, the mother soothing the fretful child, the man bending to pick up a creased bill from the floor, the one who didn't even know what he had lost, stopped in the spill of light just before making his way out the door.
Louisa, when did you first decide that you wanted to be a poet?
Well, fairly early, I knew that I wanted a life that was fundamentally connected with language. My parents taught me to read when I was 3, and I was raised as an only child for a good part of my life.
That was in addition to peeling lima beans.
In addition,
you were learning to read.
I was learning to read at a very early age. I also learned music at 3. At the same time that I learned to read, I started piano lessons. In fact, I could have been, a pianist. That was sort of one of the career options put in front of me. So because of that early childhood of reading, I was writing also fairly early on, and writing my first stories on lined first grade paper. I'd always written, always read. My mother gave me, for my 5th birthday, a book of short stories by one of the leading and most skillful Filipina short story writers in English, Estrella Alfon. She gave me this book of stories called Magnificence, and I still have this book. It's one of the items I brought back with me when I came to America. And there is an inscription, not on the flyleaf, but on the actual paperback cover of the book, and the date is there. And my mother had written, "This is in the hope that you will someday be a writer like her." So I kind of think about this whole thing and the audacity of giving a child of 5 a book of short stories, and somehow I don't know how, but I read and enjoyed them too at that age. And so I've always been aware of how delicious words are, how powerful literature is. They can, stories can take you away. You can drop into this well of stories and feel like you have stepped into another life, and you come out and, well, you're still at home, but you have been changed somehow. So that was impressed on me from a very young age. And so I think I always wanted to have something to do with language, with words. But it wasn't until I was in high school that I finally selected my genre and decided that I would work primarily in poetry.
Well, we know that memory is very important to you in your poetry. I think another aspect of our literary life that's important too is language, and you mentioned that a couple of times. How important is language to you? And in your poetry, what are you trying to do with language?
What am I trying to do with language? I'm trying to harness its ability to both capture the elusive and to capture a precise sense and texture and sound and flavor of that moment, while at the same time be able to tap into that liberating power of language to expand your insight of what is available to you at the moment. It's a difficult thing to do, and I don't know that I am explaining it to you in any way or shape that is...
It's interesting because I'm asking you to do what you write poetry for. If you want to know the way I understand language, read my poetry, because I'm telling you in my poetry. Well, welcome back to Delmarva Today, Writer's Edition. I'm your host, Harold Wilson. My guest today is poet Luisa A. Igloria. Luisa, let's talk about your own writing practice. We've hit on that a little bit, but I understand you've taken to the discipline of writing a poem a day, and that you've been doing that for 3 years. So that amounts to, do the math, how many poems now do you...
I do an accounting every so often. I haven't done it this week, but it's over 1,000 poems for sure.
You'll have to hire a bookkeeper pretty soon to keep track of the numbers. You published these poems on the website Via Negativa. A few questions here in a bundle, if you don't mind. Where do you find the inspiration for so many poems, and why have you given yourself such a task? I've read a number of your daily poems, if one can use that kind of term. They're certainly a lot more worthy of a better title than daily poem, quite frankly. Because the quality is amazingly high.
Thank you.
And the quality is incredibly consistent.
Thank you. That's very generous.
Well, it's true. It's true. So how do you get inspired every day, and how do you maintain such a high consistency of quality?
Well, let me go back to the first
part
of that set of questions.
Run the list of questions here.
Yeah. For one thing, I think writers often say that the hardest part about being a writer is the actual writing itself. And that's because we have so many things to do. And I wear, like many of you, I'm sure you do too, we wear many hats. Not only am I a teacher, a full-time academic, I also run an MFA program. I'm a mom. I'm a full-time mom. That's full-time too. I am a spouse. I help out in a few things here and there in the community every now and then. So there is very little time left in the day sometimes to be able to get to that space that you can call your own for whatever it is that you want to do. If it's not writing, your own creative space. So I have found from my life and experience that I get very grumpy. When I can't get to my writing, I am a very hard person to live with. And
we should interview your husband and let him tell us about that aspect of your writing.
No, especially for myself. I can't stand myself when I am unhappy because I can't get to my writing, because that's how integral it is to what I do and who I am. So quite without meaning to, in November, I have the date down exactly, November 20, 2010, I think we were snowed in, and that's why I stumbled onto the microblog, one of the microblogs kept by a poet who is now a friend. First, I met him in the capacity of when I was a contributor to, I'd been published at a journal that he co-edits with another fine writer and artist out of Montreal. Dave Bona is based in Pennsylvania, but I was published by Quartziluni Journal, and I've sort of, kind of kept up with what they do individually as writers themselves. And then I stumbled on his microblogs. He keeps this microblog, which is sort of nature-oriented, because he's very much an avid birder and naturalist, and And that day, I found one of his posts which had a very cool image. It described the way a woodpecker was inching up the trunk of the tree, but it used a word which is encountered perhaps more in terms of mechanical kinds of things. He used the word pawl. And I thought that that was really interesting, the conflation of these two things, one in nature and one from a sort of more mechanical perspective. And I found myself writing a poem in response to it right there spontaneously on his microblog in the comments thread. I said that was cool, and I wanted to do more. So I kept going back there and posting them. And then he noticed and he said, well, you're welcome to post them here or in my other blog, which is more dedicated to poetry and writing and that sort of thing, over at Via Negativa. So he's been really incredibly generous in sharing creative space, and he's one of those folks who believes that creativity should be shared, without any artificial limits. And he's all about, Creative Commons licenses and how artists can really collaborate more freely and openly if they work in this climate of not seclusion or isolation, or sort of, I'm keeping this precious thing under wraps and I'm not going to share it with you until I hit the jackpot, which is just ridiculous. So, right. So quite without meaning to, I did that. And now I realize what a wonderful discipline it is. I'm not a very athletic person, but I consider this probably to be the equivalent of my running daily laps for poetry, cheesy as that might sound. And so it's been over 3 years, sorry. And I write at least a poem a day, but I put one up on Via Negativa, only one up. I don't want to belabor, anybody much more than I need to. But I'm very grateful for what Dave Bona does, because he archives all of these also. And it's just a tremendous sort of additional, not service, I'm trying to find a better word for it, but just reassurance that they're there and that people can share them and see them. I have made so many friends from talking to people who have responded to these poems.
We'll read a couple of these daily
the daily poems, yeah.
See. We can all be ashamed of our daily output after you you read.
And since then, I've really been a little more loose and flexible. I don't just get prompts, because they are in a way writing prompts from his Via Negativa or Morning Porch posts, but because of the traffic that comes through there, I might see a post by some other writer who posts something in the comments thread, and I'll read you a couple that come from these sort of intersections on the web that I stumble upon. So this one, which actually made its way into the Saints of Streets, is called The Ghazal of the 1 o'clock caller looking for Pomona. I should say briefly that a ghazal is a very old form of poetry. It's Persian in origin, from the 13th century. What it is, it's individual couplets or two lines, and you will hear a refrain word or phrase at the end of every second line in every couplet. And the idea is they should be able to stand alone by themselves, but taken together as a whole, they kind of form sort of like a nice string of pearls, or that's the intent. So this one came out of reading on the web that another writer, friend, editor had written down that in her flat in London, someone kept calling her home every afternoon at 1 o'clock and leaving a message saying he was looking for Pomona. And I knew nothing about this. I did not want to hear any other details. I just thought that was fantastic by itself as a story. So, and I made the rest of it up. Ghazal of the 1 o'clock caller looking for Pomona. The shadow of a tiger swallowtail crosses my legs. I'm in the sunroom reading when the phone rings. It's 1 p.m. There's a man on the other end asking for Pomona. His voice isn't urgent or pleading, just a little gravelly and matter of fact. I tell him there is no one here by that name, but he simply insists, Pomona. For a minute I consider asking him if he knows that is the name of the goddess of fruitful abundance, In Tapestry, she presides over a cornucopia, Pomona. But I hang up after saying sorry, wrong number, and think no more of it until the very next day at 1 p.m. the phone rings again, and it's him asking for Pomona. And it goes on for weeks after this. I'm convinced even on days when I'm not home, the yellow phone in the sunroom rings at 1 p.m. It's the caller looking for Pomona. I've tried to tell him to stop calling, that no other woman lives here but me. I write poems. I grade papers. I don't make enough money. My name is not Pomona. The tea kettle whistles on the stove in alarm. I butter my toast and spoon some apricot jam, wondering if they're friends or lovers, this man and Pomona. I'll stop sometimes when I'm out in the city, that dark-haired woman running in the rain into the arms of a man at the stop. Is that him? Is that Pomona? I water orchids in the sunroom, straighten books on shelves, dust photographs of my daughters when they were younger. Do any of them resemble Pomona? She married Vertumnus, the goddess, I mean, not this mystery girl. He tricked her, disguised as an old woman. I wonder what she'd look like in drag, this Pomona. Call the police, my friends say. Call missing persons. But I'm hesitant. Did she want to be found? Did she want to disappear? Ah, this man, this caller, and Pomona.
Oh, this wonderful poem.
Thank you.
Listen, you teach creative writing, and I understand a number of your students have been fairly successful.
Mm-hmm.
Creative writing seems to me to be such a personal form of expression. How do you teach someone to write creatively?
Well, I tell them that part where the writing really comes from is probably the part that is the most solitary. And the fact that now there is a sort of proliferation of academic creative writing programs, and even creative writing programs that are non-credit in the community. You have short-term writing workshops that people can go to. People can go to book groups. People can go to a writing group with their friends. And I think that that's a wonderful way to find support for things that people have that they're doing in common. And it's something that I certainly didn't have growing up, or, even in college. I didn't cut my teeth necessarily in an academic creative writing program until I did my PhD at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and I went there specifically for creative writing. But before that, I had not really, come of age as a writer in a writing workshop setting. But I'm grateful for that perspective and what it's given me, because I think it gives me a little bit more freedom to step outside the known or established protocols for doing that sort of thing here. So I encourage my students to be as wide-ranging as they can in their energies in terms of reading and writing, and to learn as much as they can about the craft, about language. There's no other way except to immerse yourself as fully and completely in this thing that you say you're passionate about. I tell them, why are you here? What is it about the language or about writing that you love so much that you are willing to devote the rest of your life to this thing that doesn't really pay a lot of money, or fame, but what is it that drives you? And I'm gratified when they can come to me afterwards and they say things like, as a result of being in workshops or being able to read the things we do and talk about the things we do, that they have learned to listen more clearly to the sound of their emergent voices as writers, or to have those skills that will allow them to do this work in that solitary place where we all must go in order to write or create anything.
Well, let me push this down a little bit further, if I might, and do that by looking at the world of fiction again, because a lot of the fiction that I read, it turns out to be simply a narrative. And in fact, a narrative that isn't very interesting, because this happened and this happened and this happened, and then finally it's over and nothing has happened in the conglomerate. And what I want to ask is, how does a fiction writer achieve the deep and the sensitive quality of poetry in their work? The ability, as you said in the opening quote of yours that I read, to engage memory and intellect and compress and distill. Beautiful phrase, compress and distill emotion, because we know what the distillation process is. It's to winnow down to the essence, to the kernel. Idea and experience in their work. And I guess what I'm saying is that how does one inject, I guess even in their poetry, this quality of compression?
Maybe my answer is going to sound a little strange at the beginning, and I'm going to say, first of all, I think that kind of ability comes from a willingness to be vulnerable. And what I mean by this is that we need to be able to work through the claims of the ego, which are often with us in whatever we do, both in writing and in, other mundane activities that we do. The ego, which wants to dictate and control how things should go, how things should look, how there should be a grounded narrative, there is a baseline or an outline to follow. And the willingness to be a little bit more vulnerable is a work of dismantling the ego in the way that we should free ourselves up to be able to poke at what we're creating, take it apart as many times as is needed in order to arrive at where the story or the poem finally says to us, yes, I think this is organically what I think I am about, or what the poem or the story is about. And so it takes a certain amount of willingness, to take this sort of risk or leap of faith even. And that work of compression and distillation, we think we're just pushing words around on the page. But it can't be that. I guess in another sort of form of conversation I've had with you in email, I mentioned, for me, poetry, writing is also soul work. You've got to involve, your whole being, or it's all just going to be surface manipulation. And that shows in language, that shows in writing, whether you are, fully, sort of involved in this process of making, or if you're merely pushing things around in order to make them look pretty, for want of a better way of putting it right now. So it's a deep kind of engagement. It's soul work, as I like to think of it, or these are just the words in which I think of it for myself. And it's still part of that getting out of the way, the sense of trying to get out of the way of the poem or the story in order to be able to tell the story more truthfully, and more true to the story's nature or the poem's nature. And this may sound a little bit metaphysical, but these are the words in which I think about the process, that part of the process.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to continue this line for just another moment, if I could, because after reading so much of your poetry, I wrote a simple phrase down, a simple question. And it might be a strange question, but it in fact relates to what we're just talking about. And the question is, Luisa, are you a Filipina poet, or are you a poet who happens to be Filipino.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot, aren't you?
No, yeah, absolutely. That's what we're here for.
That's what we're
That's
here.
my job.
I'm a poet, but I'm also very proud to be Filipino and American.
Well, I'm going to... let me add to that, because in your writing, you mentioned a Japanese culture. You've mentioned a Chinese culture. You've mentioned, obviously, the American culture. I read another of your poems in which you talk about the Native American culture in this country. So, yes, you're very proud. I can see that in your poetry of your Filipino culture. At the same time, however, I see something more. I see something that cuts across all cultures. And I kind of call that a unifying vision.
Right. Isn't that the dream of every writer, to be able to make a connection to as many people as possible, where there are no limits that might hinder or hamper that ability to communicate with one another and to feel what we all feel and share those experiences.
And you are a poet who has found the key.
I'm
to
hoping that I have learned.
If you haven't found it,
some of
you've
those
made
things.
an exhaustive and significant search. Let me ask you to read one more poem.
Sure.
And that is, I think the name of it is Perfectibility.
Okay.
And read that one. Read that one poem.
That is actually the opening poem to the book, The Saints of Streets. Thank you. Perfectibility. Hokusai believed in the slow perfectibility of forms, in the way after 75 years or more, the eye might finally begin to understand the quality of a single filament. Vein by vein, the green curve of a leaf spirals from overhanging branches to the water below. Water that cups and gathers flecks of foam and a necklace of tiny fishing boats, their bleached hulls almost indistinct in the hollow of a wave off the coast of Kanagawa. So it is in this peripheral universe that occasionally we look up from our labors to see the swirling current, the distant mountain, the scroll of birds, our sensible garments with fraying sleeves, sprouting vines, and soaked through with the same indigo ink. The water writes what it erases, then writes again. So much of nothing, so much of everything.
Luisa Gloria, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for sharing
Thank you.
what I think is magnificent poetry. There is more in these poems than anyone could cover in an hour. So I would encourage our listeners to read your work, particularly your latest book, The Saints of Streets, and to visit your website, www.luisagloria, all one word, .com. Okay, all you writers out there, a poem a day, a story a day, even a paragraph a day. There's a challenge for you. Pencils up, paper gleaming white in its emptiness, waiting, waiting to be filled. I'm your host, Harold Wilson. Thank you for listening to Delmarva Today, Writer's Edition.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.